Welcome again. In this module, we are going to learn about web application architecture, why it's important for you as a web developer, what choices you have to make when you wanted to build your own web application. So the objective for this module is going to be to understand the difference between client-server communication model and peer-to-peer communication model. Then you have to understand what do we mean by web server, what is web server, why it's matter. Then we will understand what's the difference between front-end and back-end, and some people they call it client-side and back-end side or server side. Then we will understand the difference between static web pages and dynamic web pages. What are the differences between these two types of web pages or web application in general? Then we will understand what do we mean by MVC, why it's important nowadays in the modern web application. So let's start with the first model, which is the most common model to build a web application, which is a client server. So in this communication model, or let's say in this web application model, always the request will be sent by the client as a request to the server. The server will process this request and response back to the client. So this is like the simplest and the most abstract idea behind a client server. So it's always like this. The response will be ready once the request has been sent. So if there is no request from the client, there will be no response from the server. So in this case, or in this, let's say, paradigm, or in this model, there are like some technologies that we are usually use here on the client side, and there are like some technologies that we use on this side. So we cannot just like use one of the server side technologies to make it work as a client side technology, or the opposite side. So another model here, which is peer-to-peer model. This is like this common to see it as a web application, but as an example, one of the examples is let's say TV radio or radio broadcast a channel, for example. To build something, you have to have multiple server that works as a client and server. So in this model, each device who's contributing in the network could serve as a client or could work as a client and the server. As you can see here, all other devices should have both capabilities. Should have the capability of sending request and will have the capability of serving the files for the other people who are requesting. It's really good like paradigm to be used, but why it's not adopting by many web applications is it's really hard to maintain the files on the server. The most common, let's say, types of application that use this type of model is the torrent. In the torrent, each device who's like part of the network, he works as a client and a server. So if he has this, like, let's say if you are looking for file 1, if one of the device has file 1, then it's going to work as a server. Once you have this file on your PC, then you can act as a server too. Okay? So what is a web server? Web server, in the simplest definition, is just an application that reside or live on the server side. That's it. So we can have web server, we can have mail server. If we have, let's say, if we have a mail server, then that means we have an application that handles mail requests. And if we have a web server, it means that we have an application that handles HTTP request for web browsing. So in the simplest definition, we can say the web server is just an application that listens to any request coming to this server. And when we say like this server here, maybe it's like you can see there's mail server, web server. I mean here by server on, like let's say the server side. So we can have mail server, isolated mail server, and we can have isolated web server. But at the end of the day, it's just like for a client perspective, this is just a server. Okay, so the web server has the capabilities or listen to all the requests. So let's say usually most of the requests will be sent to the port 80. So if any request comes to the server and it finds like the communication model finds it as the protocol used is HTTP, then it's gonna be forwarded to the web server. Like the web server is gonna handle and process this request and send the request back to the client. So this is like a live demonstration on the web server. The first type of a web application is the static web pages. Usually we use static web pages paradigm when we wanted to serve just like the files that doesn't require any processing. So in another word, when we say a static web pages, that means it's pre-built web pages that is stored on the server side, and whenever a request sent by the client, the server just is gonna fetch these files and send it back to the client. So there is no any processing overhead. It's just like it's gonna find the file. If the file is found, then it's gonna send it back to the response. Most of the time, these kind of the static web pages, we use this model when we don't have that much of updates that we need, or we don't have like an interaction with the database. So let's say if you have, like let's say company A has a portfolio website. The portfolio is usually, it's not updated, like let's say it's gonna be updated once or twice a year. So it's not worth to have any dynamic web pages. So just like create it once you want to update it, then you will just like update those files and re-upload to your server. So in this case, let's try to trace the request to see how does it work. As I said at the start, there are like some technologies which work on the client side, and there are some technologies that work as a server side. For the client server side, we usually have some languages like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, which work as a client side. Okay? So here's the user. He opens up his browser and type the name, let's say www.uncc.edu. So the request will be sent to the server of UNCC. As I said, the web server is just a listener or a listening service on the server side. So once the server side sees its HTTP request, it's gonna take this request and try to figure out what is the file you are trying to find or you are trying to reach by selecting the file in the designated web server storage area. And this is really important for you as a web developer. The web server doesn't have access to all your file system on the server. Usually, you will have just an isolated area of storage to store all the files. So if you are trying to access, let's say, file index.html, the web server is going to look for it in this area only, in the designated storage area for the web server. It's not gonna search for it like anywhere in the file system. You might have it here in the file system, but the web server will not be able to see out of his storage area. So let's say the web server finds the web page you are trying to retrieve. It's gonna just take it back and send it as a response to the client. Once a response comes to the client, there is a rendering engine, which is a built-in engine in the browser. It acts as an interpreter, or let's say a compiler, for combining the HTML and CSS, or let's say it's gonna compile all the front-end technologies or the client-side technologies. So it's gonna render it, then show it as part of the browser to the user. So for now, just let's say the rendering engine is acting as a compiling. It's gonna compile the CSS and HTML files that comes from the server as a response to be able to show it on the browser for the user to be able to see it. This is like the process or the track that static web pages works. When we have a dynamic web pages, usually when we have some interaction or we have like some ability to give the user, let's say, fill out some applications or update some content, or even like, let's say, for a news website where we have a regular and frequent updates, then we must have a dynamic web pages. Why? Because we cannot just like whenever we have an update, we have to recreate, let's say, HTML files just like on the fly. So the way it's working, it's almost the same thing, but here we have some extra components here. So when the user open up the browser and type the browser name, the website name in the browser, the request will be sent to the server. The one who's gonna pick up this request is the web server, because this is a designated for the web server. The web server will try to find the file. If the file is found, then the file system will respond to the web server that we have this file. The web server have some rules that tells, like, let's say if you are trying to access a file that's written in Python, for example. So the web server has a rules here that if you have any file that is written in Python, just send this file to the interpreter for the Python. So let's say Python interpreter. So once it's like sent to the interpreter is gonna be doing like some interpretation and converting the output from normal Python code to HTML and CSS code. In this way, it's trying, we can say, like the interpreter, it's trying to convert the Python code or the server-side code to a client-side code. So the output of the interpreter here is just like a client-side code. So once it's done, it's going to be sent back to the web server, who's going to take it as it is and send it back to the response. Why the output of the interpreter here should be in just like HTML or let's say client side? Because this is the last and the final stage here before sending the response. As I said before, the client side should be able to understand its own technologies. You cannot just like send PHP or Python file as it is to the front end or to the client side. You have to send your response as a technology that the client side can understand or the rendering engine can understand. So another example, let's say we have a request here that you wanted to see what are the courses that you've taken so far, for example, in the school. You will send, or let's say, type your request in the browser. The request will be sent to the web server. Let's assume the website is written in PHP, for example. The web server will try to find the designated file in the storage area. If it's found, then the web server will try to figure out what is the rule, what should I do with the PHP file. And it will find that PHP file should be interpreted by or must be sent to PHP interpreter. So the PHP interpreter here will try to read all the rules or all the statements in that file. If the file has access to the database, then it's going to go to the database, fetch the information from the database, then compile it, all these data together, and the output of this interpretation is going to be just a client-side technologies, and it will be sent back to the web server, where the web server will send it back as a response. Once a response received by the client, the first one who's going to take it is the rendering engine, which is going to interpret all these code or client-side code and show it on the browser for the user. This is like the general overview of how dynamic web pages is working. So another important architecture or design pattern that it's really common to be used nowadays, which is MVC. So MVC stands for Model View Controller. It's usually known as a system design pattern. Nowadays, it's really, let's say, important as a web developer to know what's the meaning of MVC, since we cannot just say all, most of the frameworks use this design pattern, okay? So why we should use MVC, or why it's important, or why it's been adopted by many frameworks. First, it increases the productivity. When we say the productivity, like we say in terms of the development and in terms of, let's say, the easiness of to manage and to deal with such web application. So let's say we have a team for web designing, and we have another team who is working as a backend service or a backend developers. So every one of them is gonna just like do his work in his own, and then another people who are like usually called integration people is going to integrate these parts together. So this should increase their productivity because they are all working at the same time. When me as like a backend, I'm not waiting for the front end to finish, and the front end is not waiting for the back end to finish. It's completely separated. So another advantage of using MVC, which is the scalability. When we say like scalability means that whenever we wanted to increase or expand our system, it will give us the same quality even with this expansion. Another important advantage to use MVC, which is the maintainability. So this, since like all the components are separated, then we can just like do some maintenance on just like one component instead of just doing everything all together at the same time. So how does MVC work? When we have a user here, the first thing that a user sees is the view. Most of the time, the view has only the things that a client side can understand, which is in this case HTML, CSS, some of JavaScript, which is written for front end or client side. So the request, once it's like, let's say the interaction, let's say the user here clicks on something. So the requests here will be sent to the controller. In the controller, all the business logic will reside here in this area. So all your code as a logic and the business logic should be placed in this area here. If your system requires to access to the database, then the controller will send a request to the model here. So in the model side, when we say model, usually we mean data related information. So any logic related to the data, any updates, insert, list, or any operation that's done on the database must be completely isolated in this area here. So once it's done, depend on the framework you are using. Some frameworks, which is not that many, will update the view directly. But in most cases, the update, or let's say the output of the model, will be returned to the controller, where the controller will be like the one which is going to return the response to the view. Most people like to call the controller as the glue between the view and the model. As I said, this arrow here is dotted because, or dashed, because not all the framework is using this line here. Some let's say, of the frameworks adopt this methodology, but the others, no. All the updates on the view should be done by the controller. So as I said, like in MVC, model is the data-related logic, such as insert, update, list, delete, all database operations. So the model could be connected to either to the view or to the controller, depends on the framework, as we said. In the view is what a user sees. This would have your front-end code, such as HTML, CSS, JavaScript. In general, the view has bidirectional connection to the controller, because if you have a request to the server, it will be sent from the view to the controller, and if you have a response, it's going to be sent from the controller to the view. In some frameworks, the view might be updated by the model component or the model section. But as I said, this is not adopted by all the frameworks. In some frameworks, they adopt this methodology. In the controller, as we said, the controller is the intermediary component that glues the view and the model. Most of the time, the controller has a bidirectional link between the model and the view. So we have, like with the controller, we have bidirectional connection between the model and the controller, and we have another bidirectional connection between the view and the controller. Most of the time, people use the controller as a business logic intermediary, would be implemented in this area. That's all for this module. Hope you get something from this module, and I will see you in the next module. Thank you.